Hello and welcome to another Retro Island Diskettes, the podcast where we abandon a guest on Retro Island. And today we're winding back the clock to one of the earliest forms of computer gaming.
Neil, indeed we are, and of course we are talking about text adventures, or as the hip kids are calling it, interactive fiction. Our guest today is well known among these mystic and ancient circles as his tools have spawned hundreds of adventures.
Please join us in giving a warm island welcome to a man who's been active in the scene for over 4 decades. It's none other than Tim Gilberts. Welcome, Tim.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to be here. So, I think we did, Neil, briefly meet at Blackpool last year, but I think we'd had a couple of glasses of wine. We were playing VIC-20 adventure games, working out how to clean the back connector so we could get the VIC-20 game to work. So,
that's right.
Yeah,
we did. Yeah. Will we be seeing you again at Play Expo this year?
I'm going to Manchester, so we'll be hanging around the next stand, probably, looking like I know what I'm doing.
So, Tim, it's time to examine your first musical choice.
Oh, very clever. Yes. Okay. Yeah, get that one. I listen to a lot of classical music anyway. That's pretty much my genre of music, I suppose. So, and the ZX81 was really the moment that launched my career. I learned a lot of programming on the ZX81 in the background, but really the Spectrum was what we got involved in. And I don't know whether you know this, but at the bottom of the manual page on the music command, which of course was incredibly powerful on the Spectrum, it could make a beat for as long a duration and tone as you wanted, and it stopped the computer doing anything while it did it. But there were great things that could be achieved. And one of the exercises at the bottom, they give you a couple of bars of Mahler's Symphony, and the exercise was, complete the entire symphony. I don't think anyone ever did that till about 2014, but with a great SpectraNet interface, they hooked up at the Computing Museum quite a lot of Spectrums, and they played Mahler's Symphony.
Tim, you grew up in the seaside resort of Barry in Wales in the 1970s. Wales is somewhat famous for its musical culture. Did you have much music in your life whilst waiting for Sir Clive to release his machine in the 80s?
Oh, right, okay. Yeah, I probably did, but not the sort of music you would be thinking of, because it would have been a bit of a mix. I say quite classical because of my background. So my parents were really into sort of light opera and classical music, but also obviously, amongst my friends, I was pushed towards Sid Vicious and the punk, and so I certainly I remember getting a clip around the back of my head for singing the a little excerpt from Friggin' in the Riggin', I think. So that was as I was exiting my dad's car. So I suppose it would have been that sort of the classical and whatever I could find that was as not classical as possible.
Yeah.
And obviously later on I moved in, in the 80s then, and I was into sort of Rainbow and the usual stuff that the most people who like music sort of dally with. But I've gone back to classical in later. I'm a big fan of the sort of power ballads from pretty much anybody really. So I got a really eclectic mix. I got all sorts.
And turning our attention to computers in the 70s, what access did you have to computers in the 1970s?
Oh, very little actually, because the school had an RML 380Z, I think, and that was probably 7980. But I think before that we had a teletype terminal onto the county mainframe. Now that was probably the worst moment of my life, because as I was in the M1 maths group, and they allowed us to use the computer and learn a bit of computing. And I was allowed to stay late on after school on a Friday and use the machine. I had it dialed up. Of course, it was a big old hand modem plugged in, the old acoustic connector coupler, dialed into the computer. I was doing what I can't remember what it was. And I went home, and I got home, and I remembered I'd left it dialed in, which would mean there would be a phone call all weekend for the school. So that was a bit of a mad panic phone to the school, got hold of the caretaker and talked him through what to do to hang the line up. So so that was it, really. It was literally a teletypewriter for typing in. But we had this RML 380Z as well. And two of the maths teachers were really great. Well, one of the maths teacher and the RE teacher, they had a TRS-80 Model 1, the RE teacher, Mr. Danks, and I'm trying to think of the other guy, Mr. Arnold had a ZX80, and he lent me the ZX80 manual, and I took it home and read every word of it, which is why I was saving up for one of those. Of course, I was really into electronics at the time, so I was reading all the electronics mags, looking at the NASCOM adverts, and I let one slip away on eBay the other day, actually. I nearly fulfilled my lifelong dream to own a NASCOM. It got a bit salty, and I thought, no, I really don't need another dead board to fix that much. So, but it was nearly there. I was nearly there. So, and obviously the MK14 and all the scrumpy type ones, I was going to buy one of those, and then I saw the 80. I thought, I'll get one of those. And then Clive announced the 81, and that was it, really. It was cash on the table, and off I went.
So those early experiences would go on to culminate in the creation of your company, Gilsoft, in the early 80s. But could you tell us a little bit more about the path you took to reach that stage? Did you become a programmer at home or was it via school?
Well, like I said, school had the after club, which was a little bit of programming teaching, but the reality is they were about 4 pages ahead in the book for us on the basic. And of course, most people had to send off the punch cards for the Cecil language. And that's how I got into programming, actually. Mr. Danks lent me his TRS-80. And I wrote a Cecil interpreter so the kids in school could actually just type them straight in and get results back straight away. He lent it to me for several weeks at home, and I just taught myself BASIC well enough to write it. And now, obviously, that was, like we said, we produced that for the Dragon and the ZX81. And then, of course, we did do a version, I think, for the Spectrum. It sold quite well, actually, into schools because it was a cheap way for schools to get a Cecil, which is on the curriculum. It's a cheap way for them to let the kids play directly with it. So we didn't bad out of that. But thanks to Mr. Danks for lending me his TRS-80.
So did you go straight into sort of business, straight after school or college?
Well, that's a bit of a rough story. I was actually in college because the school didn't offer computing at A-level. So the local college, which is literally over the fields from the back of the school, they offered computing as an A-level. So obviously I signed up for that. And there I got my hands on a multi-user system. It wasn't a DEC, what was it? It was an Alpha Micro. Now, they're quite a rare beast as well. And they had big 8-inch floppy drives and definitely multi-user. So I basically spent as much time as I could in college learning a bit more. We were sort of selling the Cecil at that time, but we weren't advertising it really heavily. It's just word of mouth and people, teachers knowing each other. But that really gave me a chance for the Alpha to learn a decent system, and it taught me a lot of programming, a bit formally, I suppose, more than I'd done informally. By then, I also had the ZX81 because I'd done a project in school in assembly language to self-taught at home, just punching away out the back of the ZX81 manual. It had a list of all the opcodes, and I couldn't work out how relative jumps worked. So I used to add I put like 4 no operation codes in, and then make the number -3 further. So I'd hit one of the knobs, and it seemed to work usually. So I got a bit better as I got on, but I was literally poke and hope. There was a lot of the engineering learning there, and I did treat myself to a copy of Zach Z80, and I can't lift that up because all the pages fall out, I'm afraid. But yeah, it was mostly self-taught, but I did get the advantage of some formal education through the A-level computing course in school. And it was through that we set the business up, and we started to get really busy as a company while I was doing the A-level, to the point where We'd written, I was hacking a lot of games to make joysticks work because the Kempston port came out and the joysticks didn't work on the games. So I spent a lot of time hacking and working out how they worked and coming up with pokes so you could make the joystick, patch it into the keyboard routine. And I'd done a lot of them, like Horace Goes Skiing and a couple of the big ones, Penetrator. So I had all these written. One Friday I started doing it, and by Monday morning we had about half a dozen and we could hack them. So we sold those on a tape called Softlink. I think we only sold it for about 3 weeks though, because then Kempston rang us up and said, "Oh, can we buy that off you? That'd be really good to sell to give away with our joysticks. So can you do some more for us?" So that's how I really started sort of getting heavily involved in earning money doing, and it was quite a bit of money for a weekend's work. Yeah. And I think they bought all our stock off us as well, because I remember him asking Dad how many we had, and he said, "Oh, at least 300. We must have spent all week making those 300 copies."
But you're obviously becoming an accomplished programmer, and I often get the impression that for the pioneers of the games industry, a grounding in business is very much secondary to coding skills. Were you a businessman first? I don't think I need to finish this question. Were you a businessman first or a coder first?
No, definitely a coder. I worked till 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, slept all morning, didn't take any phone calls, pretty much bought every computer we could get with whatever profit we had. Dad was the same one. He'd always had a sideline business. I think I said in my sort of attempt to get a tune in before the first one called The Overture that he had me making chroma chime doorbells, which were based on a TMS 1000 processor and play 24 tunes. So those sounds were ringing in my ears, making hundreds of bells that he was selling through a network of people, usually salesmen who'd called to the house to sell him something, who went away with a 20 of them on sale or return to sell while they were selling. I've never bought anything off them, but he always sent them away with a pile and a deposit for the sale of these. So he always had something he was doing on the side, and he was the one who knew a little bit about how to make a business work, and he was a very savvy bloke. So it was him who gave the business head. I was the typical teenager who worked hard when he felt like it, and
So yeah. Tim, would you like to introduce your next tune, please?
Oh dear, yes, I probably would. I had a bit of difficulty here because of course, it's going to be a SID chip tune, because by now we'd got a Commodore 64 and it was frankly amazing, some of the stuff that was being produced for the 64. So I did buy quite a few games for the 64 because it really was quite a good gaming machine. So I was going to pick Gunship, but that's just Ride of the Valkyries done well. So I settled on Uridium because I played that for hours and hours and hours, and you just can't forget that tune, really, can you? And it just showed early on what the SID was really capable of, and the game itself just really it showed what you could achieve with a C64. So I have to say that is probably my memory of the early 80s gaming, more than Spectrum games, actually. Sad to say. So.
Tell us about the foundation of Gilsoft and when and how this happened.
Right. Well, I think it happened at the ZX Microfair in March when the Spectrum was sort of put on public display, because I remember running to a public telephone and phoning my dad and saying, use the details of the phone number to order one, get the credit card out and order one. This is the machine that's going to make us some real money. So, and I said, it's got the Z80 in it. I know that I can get some games out fairly quickly for this, I think. Let's get in as early adopters. And that was the moment Gilsoft got launched. The name, obviously, not as one person who wrote into us suggested, is because Barry is by the sea. which has fish in it. And I'll let you complete the rest of the Gil. But it sort of came from the nickname we had for us when we were doing electronics work, which is Gilbertronics. So I think it was just natural to call it Gilsoft, really.
You mentioned March.
But yeah.
Can you remember what year this was? Was this 81, 82?
Well, this would have been 82 when the Spectrum was announced. Yeah, definitely, because we put the first advert in the October issue of Your Computer, I think, which came out in September, obviously, because the magazines always came out the month before. So we basically, I think we got the Spectrum around July. And so I had August, basically, to write the first 4 or 5 games. You can imagine the quality. I had been working on them before we got them on the ZX81. I'd been doing some of the assembly routines and things ready because we were waiting for the shipping. And I'd read everything I could get on the Spectrum. So I was fairly confident I understood some of it. So planning was done and just whacked around. 3D Maze of Gold was the first big one, which I was quite pleased with. I think it still stands up today. It's quite a quick animation on the Spectrum using the attribute track. So moving false 3D effect, it works quite quickly. So wasn't as good as Monster Maze, which inspired it, but J.K. Gray had the first mover on that one.
Yeah. What was the name of that first game of yours again? I didn't quite catch it.
3D Maze of Gold.
3D Maze of Gold.
Yeah, absolutely. You can play it online at archive.org, I think, if you really want to. So,
and did you make a special trip down to the shops to see that on the shelves, or was that sold mail order?
It was only sold mail order, although we did actually, once we set up and started selling more widely through distributors, it got a bit of a makeover and was on the shop shelves with other games as well. So the later packaging was much better for it. But yeah, we would mail order for the first probably 6-9 months, and microfairs, of course. So.
And it was a year later, in 1983, when Gilsoft released the now legendary package for the ZX Spectrum, the Quill. Can you give us the sales pitch? What is the Quill, Tim?
The Quill. Well, it's 100% machine code system for writing your own computer adventure games without needing to know anything about computer programming. So you too can write a game as good as anything that can be produced for the ZX Spectrum by anybody. And that was it. It was we called it the pen for the budding adventure author. It's the tool you need, basically. And I think it was a really clever product. I was impressed with it. Graham had written this sort of system. I don't know whether you know the background. Graham had written this sort of system for making adventure games he lent me, which was basically the assembly file and some data statements, and you could type it all in and then assemble it and then stitch it to the interpreter. And I said, well, this is really easy for writing adventure games, and but not easy for anyone who's not a programmer who understands and hasn't got an assembler. So can we do something that makes it really easy for people? And I had sort of like a compiler assembler type idea in my mind, I suppose, and Graham disappeared away, and he said, I don't know, it probably wouldn't sell. He might have a couple 100 copies, but it might be interesting to do. He turned up with this editor about 3 or 4 weeks later saying, what do you think? Well, this is an approach. And many hours of phone calls and tweaking and improvements and things over the months, it came together. And he was a really clever guy, and he really put a bit of effort into making it easy to use, and we hammered it and tested it to destruction, and it just worked, and it was easy to use. So
I think that I've always been fascinated with text adventures as well as many other people. So could you give us a basic rundown of how does a text adventure parser actually work?
Okay, well, actually the Quill one's really, really simple because it just takes the first 5 letters of whatever you type, split it up with any spaces you use. The first 2 words, it just takes the 5 letters, looks it up in a table. It gets that number that's associated with that one, because obviously words are long and complicated, whereas one number from 1 to 255 is easy for a programmer to manage. And then you've got a list of things to do if you get a combination of those 2 numbers. And that's basically what it does. So every time you type that combination of numbers, which usually the first one's a verb, second one's a noun, it does that particular thing, like print a message on the screen, or make an object appear, or make an object disappear, or add one to your score. So it is literally nothing more than that. And it all stems from the same thing. Whether you're moving in a direction, going north is just changing the number that represents your location from being this numbered location to that numbered location. So you just have a north is number 1, so you get 1. And then we have a special marker for no other words, so just type in north. A couple of them, N or north, would come to the same number 1. So the same entry that says move your location to location 3, which is effectively a go-to statement. That's all it does. Whichever word you type, it always converts to number 1, always does north. And that's it. And it's just built up from loads and loads of those.
I almost want you to stop. You're ruining the magic, the mystery behind how adventure games work. But
Core is much cleverer, much cleverer, trust me. That really does understand English.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to coming on to Paul. We'll talk about that shortly. But with the Quill, as you've explained, it's effectively an adventure game is made up of locations, objects, characters, and so much more. So was the Quill effectively just like a fun database? Is that what was going on underneath it all, really?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. It is nothing more than a database full of fun. And really, it was for people to pour their knowledge into, because I suppose that the difficulty with any sort of writing a program is getting that framework. A lot of people produce games fairly rapidly because they write an engine and then all they got to do is edit the levels. And that's how back in the day people had these sort of games. They were all based on a similar couple of engines. It was just, for us, we gave the engine to people first with a little editor, much like the level editors that appeared later. So
in 1984, the Quill was awarded Best Utility in the Crash Readers Awards. So your software was clearly well received. But there was stiff competition at the time in text adventures from the likes of Infocom, games like Zork. Did you have time to try out your competition? And if you did, which titles really stood out?
I did, yeah. Obviously, we did buy quite a few of the competitor games. Obviously, I had a copy of The Hobbit on the Spectrum, which was basically a seminal work. I never played the Zork series, but I did have things like Adventure 1 from Abersoft, so all of the Arctic adventure games, Adventure ABC. And on the Infocom side with the C64, I had a copy of Suspended, which I thought was a really clever science fiction story. I liked that one with the multiple control angles and things like that. So, it was certainly something I was playing. Plus, when I had a CPC, I had quite a few of them on the Amstrad as well, because the monitor was quite good for playing text adventure games. So rather than a TV. So yeah, I played quite a lot of them. And of course, once the Quill started producing games, we were sent very large quantities of games to look at. So I certainly was well aware of those, including the commercial ones. Companies like Eighth Day and that they sent us copies of their games as a gesture, I suppose, of thanks. We had lots of stuff. So.
Yeah.
And plenty to play.
Yeah. You also ported the Quill to a host of 8-bit systems. Did you come across any particular challenges on these systems? Did any system stand out as one that you liked best to work on?
Yeah, I really liked the Commodore 64. It's such a clever machine. It's got paging, and it sort of started to show some of the things you'd see on later computers with overlaying memory areas. So, you could hide stuff under it and things like that. It was a very clever machine. I didn't do the 6502 port of Quill to C64, but I did do the Illustrator. So that's why I like the C64. I did the 6502 based on Graham's code for the Auric Atmos, and that was a great little machine, to be honest. They're quite underrated. They were with the disk drive on them. They were quite a nice machine to use. They had a lovely clear display, nice, very easy 6502 machine. I quite like the 6502 machines in that respect. So MSX was a bit boring, I think, really, but there were loads of them. Yeah. So it looked like the Japanese invasion was going to succeed. So we did have a few of those. And I quite liked, for a quirky one, the Mematech 512, the black sort of brushed aluminium one. We did have one of those we were sort of half converted to, which we never finished, I think, on the 8-bits. I think it never really took off. So a bit like the Dragon, it got abandoned as probably not worth doing.
But you did start a conversion on the Dragon, though, didn't you? Even if you didn't finish
absolutely. Yeah. Yes, yeah. The Adventure Interpreter was definitely done on the Dragon. So, I think we were chatting earlier, it was my lesson for learning to save, because I direct transcoded 6502 to 6809 because I was bored of writing it down on the printout, and I hit C-save and it didn't C-save. It just froze completely, and I lost probably hours and hours of a whole day's work. So I've got remnants of it. I've got fragments that have been saved. So one day it'll see the adventure games. I promised the Dragon community it'll get finished. So I got the little printed labels and the covers ready for the games. So it's certainly the first two adventure games. So one day I'll put them on a sticker on a cassette. I'm determined.
So, Tim, was Barry still the headquarters of your operation, or had you moved to Silicon Valley at that point?
No. We were definitely in the only valley we were in was south of the valleys of Wales, to be honest. So, Barry is pretty much the focus. I don't know the geography, but it's pretty much like a hand. They say it's a hand laid out like this, the 5 valleys of South Wales. And Barry's really where everything arrived, because it was set up to take all the coal that was coming out of the valleys that Cardiff Docks was charging a fortune to export. So Barry was built basically as a competitor to Cardiff. So, it was always the underdog, but always going to create some real challenges. So we stayed where we were. We did move around a bit. I mean, it was obviously originally the attic and my bedroom in 30 Hawthorne Road. Then we rented an office space down on the main road in Holton Road. That was quite a nice little office. So we had to set up with all the computers, and we needed the space. It came with like a receptionist and a shared office space environment. But fairly soon after that, we bought the building 2 Park Crescent, which was where we pretty much ran the business from. And I used the upstairs as a flat. Downstairs was the offices and computer room, and we pretty much ran from there then for the rest of the business. So,
fantastic.
Yeah.
Tim, before we find out more about Gilsoft, can you introduce us to your next track, please?
I can. It's obviously pretty much by the end of the 80s. We saw the Game Boy, and it was Tanaka's piece from Tetris, the A music, just because I am the only one in the family who's completed it. And the boys still don't know what the end sequence looks like. And I was just obsessed with the game. I just spent my time on it was my lad's Game Boy, but I just spent hours playing that game. I don't know why, but I just was absolutely and utterly addicted.
Because there are so many copies of the Quill out there, do you recall any of the letters or feedback you got from any of your users?
We did get quite a lot, mostly asking questions about how to do things. I don't remember any specifically, although I should probably publicly apologise to the one that was sent to Mr. Howlett. He was a crushed 14-year-old whose game was not published by Gilsoft, apparently, although he's still awaiting his adventure assessment sheet, I think, that we were supposed to have sent out. We never did, so I publicly apologise in here. But we ran a help desk. It was more popular on a Tuesday evening. We offered a phone-in service, so you could ring in with questions and things. So we had a lot more phone calls and technical support questions than we did letters. We did get quite a few, but they were mostly just saying thanks for it, or will you look at my game. But the evening ones, we had some really unusual questions and phone calls. I remember some guy phoning from a hospital. He was playing classic. He was playing a copy of Adventure on a hospital PDP-11, and and he was stuck somewhere in the underground maze. And he said, "Is this the adventure helpline?" I said, "Yes." So here we are. I answered the question. I knew roughly how to map a maze, so I was able to help him.
Well, I believe there were some commercial games produced using the Quill. Some reports say over 450 published titles were made with it. Was there a danger, do you think, in diluting the text adventure market by making the tools so readily available, or could this number of text adventures be sustained?
Absolutely, there was a risk of polluting the text adventure market, we probably caused that to happen. But then again, it was still difficult to get it published. There was no, even doing it at home was a non-trivial task. Paying for an advert in a magazine, creating a cover, making the advert sound. It took some other skills to actually do, other than be just yet another adventure game, I think. And to get it round past a publisher, it usually had to have something special about it. So I think the cost of entry was already started to climb, because by the time the Quill came out, even by 83, 84, there were publishers moving in. Things were starting to go into shops, and it, mail order was already, while it was busy, it was still on its tail, wasn't it, as a specialist area. So I think the ones that made it through to commercial, on the whole, they were pretty good. Some of the big companies like Eighth Day, they published quite a lot of them. There was a really good mix, and it gave variety, much like the sort of, I would have thought you could compare a lot of them maybe to the sort of the little paperback novels you had on the rotating in the department store, rather than buying off the bookshelves of the Blackstones and things. So there's always an occasional gem amongst them as well, and there was a big appetite, I think, for games as well, and a lot of authors were happy. I mean, they didn't have to sell tens of thousands of copies if there were a couple of hundred people playing the games they liked. Ultimately, that's great as well, because a lot of people create for what they're doing. I mean, I certainly don't write the code I do to make money out of it anymore. I do it because I enjoy it. So, if it allows you to express yourself as easily as, you can write a book easily with a pen and paper, but to write an adventure game, you do need a tool, really, if you have no programming skills. So, and it's about the creative process, isn't it? We all enjoy creating things.
So as much as I enjoy text adventures, there was always going to be a share of the market who would shun this type of game, and they wanted graphics support graphics to support their lack of imagination. So did you ever go on to do anything about that?
We did indeed. The illustrator was really, Graham was a great text adventure fan. He didn't see the need for graphics. Me, I loved The Hobbit with the pictures. You read books like, the classic books often had small illustrations in the corners, and some ideas from it, especially things like The Hobbit. They have those that clue to the imagination, the line drawings, and that's what the illustrator let you do. And what The Hobbit had was almost suggestions of what you should be thinking about. And I think it still left a lot for the imagination, and I think it adds to a game a lot to have an illustration for not for every location, but for the key ones, just to provide a bit of context from the author's imagination as well, because there is limited words on a computer screen in the early days. I think the Infocom Adventures really benefited from the disk drives, but certainly on the 8-bits, an illustration in 200 bytes could say a lot more. 8 or 9 pages of prose would take a lot more space than that, so it could give you a very good hint of the location. So I was a big fan of it, which is of course why I set to and produced the Illustrator as a product on the Spectrum, and then onto other machines as well. We did it for Amstrad, Commodore 64. It was and it did sell very well as an add-on to the Quill. There were a lot of people who wanted to draw their graphics. So.
Was it a sort of I'm going to say Microsoft Paint type package? Did you actually just draw on the screen?
No, it was a vector drawing package, pretty much like the name Illustrator is used today. It was a vector package. You could edit lines and shapes, and it stored it in a very compressed form. It just stored the order you drew the picture in, so it recorded the lines you'd drawn and the circles and the fills you'd created and the color changes. So it could create that sort of style of picture in a very, very small space, literally 60 or 70 bytes. You could get quite a big picture in it.
So it's almost a package.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, very much. And in fact, that got me my first job. So maybe that's a thing we come back to when we talk a little bit later about what happened to me later in life. So having written it, I need to make it clear it was called the Illustrator. That isn't anything to do with the current use of the word Illustrator, which is a very famous drawing package. It's in the same way.
So it didn't evolve into Adobe Illustrator.
No, its name did, because eventually we actually sold the trademark Illustrator, which is now resides with the current owner.
Oh wow! So it is the root of the name.
Yeah.
Great. Well, moving now to 1986, Gilsoft comprised of yourself, Graham, and Phil Wade. Quill's been on the market for 3 years at this point, so you're obviously thinking about next steps. What did you need to do next then?
Well, I think bring them all together, because we had, obviously, Phil had done this great little package to do compressed text. The press, he'd really been hammering away at the ZX micro drives to get them to do things that they said couldn't be done in a manual. They were obviously, much as they were a little bit derided, they were actually affordable and people did have them. And the disk drives were quite expensive. So, and there were a lot of drives around. We were using the Disciple by then. We had an Opus. All of those little add-ons that we might have done for the Quill to allow you to use disks and things seemed logical to pull them out. It was getting more complex for the user, because they had to do this and then load it into there and patch that. And it just sort of got away from it was easy to use. So pulling it all together into one product was where we had to go. And that was Paul, obviously, the professional adventure writer, which, we also, the competition games, they were all talking about, Orbit had shown you could do an English language parser, not just a verb noun. Infocom games had more complex interpreters. So we really needed to up our game on the English language understanding as well, the interpreter side of it. And it just seemed logical. Then it all came together, this product.
So before we start digging into Paw, can you please introduce your next track?
Yeah. We're moving ahead at a different pace with the music than we are with Life on, because a lot happened in the 80s. But really, the reason I picked Aladdin on the Mega Drive was obviously by 93, children were around and we had a Mega Drive, and my son wants to play Streets of Rage, but we didn't want him playing it because we thought it was violent. But the music was amazing, so I couldn't really pick that. That would be a bit insulting to him, wouldn't it? But we did play a lot of Aladdin, and I think it's just a really great game. And the tune just shows what the machine can do. The Yamaha chip in that Mega Drive is great, and it's run by a Z80, isn't it? So from a technical back end, because the 68000 is the main processor thing, but it's a Z80 doing that music with a Yamaha chip. So in many ways, it's a little Spectrum playing that, isn't it?
So, Tim, Gilsoft wasn't actually your only job at this point, was it?
No, actually, it wasn't my job, because by this time we were Gilsoft International Limited, of which I was a director. We brought in accountants to manage the money that was coming in and give us professional advice. And the first thing they did was sack me. Because I'd been employed by the company as a programmer, but they said, no, don't do that. If you do any programming, you do as a contractor like anyone else. You act as a director of the company. So I'd set up another little company called Infinite Imaginations. And so I was working for other publishing houses like CRL and people like that. He'd also sold some very lower quality games, shall we say, through other distributors. Had a crack at some arcade games, but they were still along the side of what we were doing in Gilsoft to do the programming. So yeah, I sort of had two jobs really.
And back at Gilsoft, you've developed. We've touched on Paul, the professional adventure writer. what sort of features did this bring in? You said it pulled together the three previous packages, Quill, Illustrator, and what was the final package?
Actually, it was two, Press. And also characters, which allowed you to change the characters and fonts. So really, really nice font designer someone had done for us that came with 22 really great fonts. So it brought that in as well. So you could have your own on-screen font changes and things, which are really easy to use. And a little font editor. So you could draw your own character sets and things, which it just made it all easy in one package. So I think the key thing was it was all in one menu, did everything and saved the final game. Allowed you to do proper full English diagnosis. So you could take the gold key carefully and drop it down the well, which, and he understood that by itself by breaking it down into verb noun for you. So you still only had to program the verb and noun statements and then look for extra words like, have we got an adverb of carefully and have we got an adjective of yellow? And you'd have to check for some extra conditions yourself, but it fitted naturally into the way the parser worked. So for the user, their games could understand English quite easily and quickly. And it dealt with all the funnies like getting rid of and or and when we finally did the Spanish one, it got rid of all the funny word endings. So.
And no doubt there was a blacklist because we all like to type the rude words into the adventure games to see what happens.
We never had a blacklist in the game at all. You could put as many swear words in as you liked, but most games tended to just do something humorous with the swear words. But if you look at the old databases, some of them have got a massive list of swear words in them. Some I didn't know back then.
That it would be hilarious to go looking at the source code of some old games to see what people at the time thought were rude words.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot of people say, will I open source any of the stuff we did back then? Well, a lot of it is going through the code and getting rid of all the swearing in the code from where you've been debugging for a week.
It might not be politically correct anymore.
Absolutely not.
So I was looking through some of the features of Paw. I noticed you were supporting NPCs and a few features that started to make it sound like it was getting dangerously close to sort of multi-user dungeon type games. Were you ever tempted to make that leap?
We were, very much. We'd already talked about it. When I came back from Spain in the early 90s, I was chatting to my dad, we'd come up with a game concept called Embryo, which was basically a multi-user dungeon to play what was then the nascent internet. Because I had to dial up to the internet itself didn't exist, but I had to dial up to a UUCP supplier, and you could go online to BBSs, and so the sort of multiplayer dungeon stuff was starting to appear. And we were clutching at an idea about you could create your own little dungeon that you could invite people into, so how it could be multiplayer. So we were on the verge of that, I think, and because that pretty much was what I was thinking of doing when I come back from Spain, but the world changed suddenly, as we'll talk about later. So it never got off the ground. But it was another good idea for a name. So I'm sure we would have had quite a good product there. But it was very much armchair design. But yes, we were clutching a sort of combination, I think, thinking back, having seen it. There's a PlayStation game, what's it called, with a cloth guy in it. He's a little rag doll where you make your own mechanics and... what's it called?
Is it Little Big Planet? Not that one?
Yeah, Little Big Planet. That's it. Exactly like, you can create your own world and invite people in. That sort of idea, I think, was what we were clutching at. But I don't think the technology was really there at the time. But I think that was where we were looking to go. So you could create your own little multi-user dungeons. So someone's done it. It's great. And I got Little Big Planet 2 as well, which is great.
And if anyone was wondering, the picture on the wall behind you, that's your Crash Readers Award for your first product, the Quill. Was Paw...
No, it's Paw, actually. That's Paw.
That's for Paw. I was about to ask, was Paw as well received as the Quill? But you've got that on your wall, so clearly it was.
Yeah. When we were pleased. I mean, Crash was a great magazine anyway for the gamer, so to get that, and it was very focused on arcade games, but they did have the adventure, and to have the Readers Award twice for two products is quite an honour, I think, really.
Brilliant. So Paul produced over 400 commercial games, so you're now responsible for at least 850 game releases. Did you ever wish you worked in some sort of royalty into the licensing?
This discussion has happened a few times, but I'm fairly certain we would not be responsible for that many games. I think this number's been up to be. There was a research on the 8-Bit Adventure Forum. I think it's more like 1,000 odd now.
Wow.
So we're fairly certain it's that would not have happened, because the whole point was, we were giving away the tool. It was because people had the tool that the quantity was produced. We talked about that a little bit earlier, I think. But yeah, I'd love to have had some royalties from every game ever produced. But there we go. I'm happy. I can afford a tyre for my car. So.
Perfect. Well, we're starting to see more sophisticated text and graphic adventure systems enter the market now from the likes of companies like Sierra. 1984's King Quest used a parser system, but also direct control of the character, and you had that third-person perspective. You could see your little guy marching around the screen, as well as animation, musical scores, things like that. LucasArts, similar, in 1987 with Maniac Mansion. Yeah. Were you tempted to take your game creation system in that direction? Would that have been the next step for you?
Yeah, we were. We were thinking about the point and click market, but and I suppose by the sort of late 80s, this was sort of some of the features that were built into the system that Abstract Concepts commissioned from us. Swan, system without a name, that actually had sort of icon and graphics point and click support, certainly for the 16 bits. Rather than the 8 bits, but it was also built into the 8 bits as well. But without the mouse, it was harder to use. But yeah, those sort of features were starting to come. Whether we would have put it into a product that we sold like that, I don't know. We were just busy. Well, I was busy working directly for them by then, and I think it naturally became part of the product, and we didn't go that way that we were producing for other people. But yeah, I think it would have been something we'd have gone down the route of. We already had some of the code, which is why Abstract Concepts had the icon system fairly quickly.
I imagine you'd very quickly get to a point where you're starting to introduce such an overhead in the editing system that you're leaving less room for an actual game to be created at that point.
Absolutely, and in fact, you could write these sort of games with things like STOS that were coming out by then. It was pretty much. In fact, I jokingly say that all arcade games are just adventure games that are running in the key checking much faster. Because they are modern arcade games are just you're moving. Up, down, left, right is north, south, east, west. It's changing the picture very rapidly. You're collecting things, you're dropping things. All game genres are the same, aren't they? It's just the way it's told. I think once you get to that level of point and click, then the trip over into the sort of Tomb Raider environment is very easy to make, the full 3D rendering, and really they're just stepping stones to that environment, whereas text adventures stand as a sort of genre on their own. I think that everything else was a progression towards the interactive, three-dimensional world building type environment. They point and click adventures are clever. I think they're quite good, especially now with the recent release of Bandersnatch has shown that maybe there's a new world for it on a choose your own type adventure type game. So that maybe we've gone down a route too far with just thinking about 3D first person adventure world. Maybe there's something in the older ways of point and click that people do. A few Kickstarters around for them again. Maybe see if they're popular still. Maybe it won't be the last product from us.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you were working freelance at that time on the side. So what was happening to Gilsoft at the moment? Was it still a viable business? Was it still thriving? Mum and Dad, and as a director, obviously, we were still selling the products we had. We were still taking in new adventure games that had been written with the system and publishing them. But I think we're talking about the late 80s here now. The sort of text adventure market is really starting to die off. We haven't got any new valid product that we're really pushing for. I'm doing all the consultancy for other companies, starting to get involved in the Spanish market. Then by 87, 88 was Abstract Concepts and the stuff they were doing, Mindfighter, adding audio to games and things like that. And then sort of in 88, then the Spanish, repeating what we'd done in Spain really with Aventuras AD. So, and their Spanish system DAD. So, it wound down as a company by then. So naturally came to an end. We were a two-shot pony, should we say.
in preparing for this interview with you, we came up with a few ideas ourselves for modern uses of text adventures. So I'm looking forward to talking to you about that a bit later. Almost feels like we're going into the Dragon's Den to pitch some ideas to you. But, before we move on, can you introduce us to your next tune, please, and tell us why you've chosen it?
Okay. I think, and I just mentioned it actually in the discussion, it's the next jump to what Adventures became, and it's Tomb Raider, obviously. By 96, we had a PS1 in the family. The kids were playing the Formula One and Abe's World and things like that. But my wife and I were really into Tomb Raider. She worked nights, so we used to have a couple of hours in the evening to play Tomb Raider together. She didn't like the controls, but she loved solving the puzzles and the problems, and she was really good at spotting stuff, like the butterflies flying around. Is there anything happening over there? And finding the side passages. So we pretty much played the whole series of Tomb Raider. The original was obviously the one I've picked. But we played everyone in the whole series. But I wasn't allowed to play after she left for work. I was allowed to do the washing up and leave the game till the next day.
In the modern world of gaming companies, as soon as you create something successful, you're bought out and swallowed up by a bigger fish like Microsoft or Sony. Was Gilsoft ever approached?
No. No, absolutely not. Although, like I say, we did sell out the Softlink 1, which became the Kempston software that was supplied with their joystick, and we stopped selling it ourselves and never referred to it again. So that was sold outright to them as their idea. So that's the only time I think we've ever sold outright completely. But no, absolutely not. No one ever wanted us.
And Professional Adventure Writer then was your flagship product at this time. When did sales start to drop off on that?
I mean, we were still selling it fairly strongly, I think, into the late 80s. Dad was certainly selling stock off in when I was in Spain in 89. So I think he started the homebrew business in 89. As an alternative, because sales were really starting to dip to a point where it wasn't providing the extra income he was used to, so I not at that level, but it was providing a little bit of extra for him and my mum. I was abroad, he had a property, and we opened the shop, or they opened the shop to sell homebrew stuff and switched their business. I think they were still selling the tail of it, though, for into the early 90s. Mm-hmm. Because we certainly had a little office in the back of the shop that they were still dispatching odds and bobs. So it's quite surprising, really. So
was it just that you were so busy in Spain that there was no successor lined up? You were just busy on other projects?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'd gone contractor. I'd gone contractor in 87, really. And, we had a number of programs around. Phil was obviously interested in music. He was a musician, and he had other things. It was all part-time jobs from Graham. Still had a full-time job. He worked for British Telecom. There was really, everyone was doing things. Hugh had moved abroad, I think, by this time, who did a lot of the conversions we'd done, because he was the sort of 68,000 initial with the QL, and then some of the Atari stuff we did. So we just didn't have that extra product production capability. Of no full-time programmers really. So we were not in the hub. You joked about Silicon Valley, but it was really London, where it was very focused, and Sheffield and the big cities where the production was and the programmers were gravitating to, and that's where things were happening. They weren't happening in Sleepy Little Barry, really.
With a few notable exceptions, such as Magnetic Scrolls Wonderland, released in 1990, the text adventure fell out of favour. Zork was now a full-motion video multimedia title, and point-and-click adventures were all the rage with the fickle kids. Were you saddened that the humble text adventure was heading for extinction, or did you move with the times and enjoy adventure games of the 90s?
Both, I think, is the best answer to that, because I enjoyed what was coming out. I mean, obviously, I did play games. I had the machines. Of course, in the late 80s, early 90s, I was abroad and enjoying life in Spain. So I pretty much didn't know what was happening in the market. I think I was very much focused on that area. And by the time I got back in the 90s, I suddenly had a job and a wife and children, and then inherited a child. And it was just, the world changed. And then it was, like you say, that's where Aladdin came from, and, the sort of Tomb Raider games. And yeah, I made full use of the PS1 and that sort of gaming environment. I became a games consumer, and I think they were really clever. I mean, whatever, I think that sort of game, it's just really amazing to take a first-person perspective, but it still had the adventure elements in it, which is what I enjoyed. But I still play the odd text adventure as well, even today, because I've always been a big reader. I love reading books, and it very much feels more like the experience of a book. It's not as fast-paced. You can go at your own pace, and I find it less stressful. So I'm wondering whether we create a stress level for ourselves with this sort of modern game, the pace all the time. There's nothing to slow down with, and an adventure game can be quite challenging without being fast-paced. So maybe it's a bit of a useful lesson in today's society of everything fast all the time.
Do you feel with modern technology such as e-book readers, mobile phones, there could be a resurgence of text adventures?
They're not very easy to use. The text adventures really need a keyboard to type on, I think. Chris Ames has done really great with Adventure On, if you haven't come across it. It's a sort of HTML5 game designer, and it works on mobile phones, iOS, Android, and it makes the games really quite playable. He's done really well, and I think, yeah, it's a possibility. If people rediscover them as they have. I mean, who knows? Only Flappy Bird would be a massive popular hit. If it takes all it needs is somebody to be taken with it, and it suddenly to become cool, and everyone thinks, oh wow, this is something we've not seen before. Because there's probably a whole generation of people who don't even know they exist.
And the library of Quill adventure games is perfectly accessible now, because there's a Windows implementation of the Quill, isn't there, that can open those old files and even write them back. You can edit them, and you can even write them back in an Amstrad CPC or a ZX Spectrum format and play them. So there's nothing to stop you accessing those old adventures. Now, here's the pitch. Here's the pitch, Tim. We'd love to be able to play adventure games with voice recognition in our cars. This is what Andrew and I have come up with modern speech synthesis, which is easy for me to say, to describe the adventure as we're driving and as we're playing. Can you see that working? Can you do an update to pause to make that happen for us?
Well, funny enough, I had thought about that, because with a Siri skill, it would be fairly easy to do, to take an existing game and add voice to it, because the processing is very similar, I think. Scott Adams, and he's got a new venture called Clopas, which you may or may not know about. He's currently getting some beta testers together for a new skill. All he said is a new skill for Alexa. Well, I'm going to be 99% certain that's a voice recognition text interpreter.
Absolutely, yeah.
And there is a working sample. You can play Zork online as an Alexa skill with Amazon. It's not. It shows some of the limitations of taking an existing game, to work in that environment. But it does rely on audio. Again, Chris Ainsley and I talk quite a lot about this, and to actually provide audio in an adventure game is very, very demanding, because it has to be everywhere, and you have to record it for every outcome and possibility as well. So it ups the production cost, again, quite significantly from just writing text. But if you do it, it's a very, very effective and atmospheric thing, I think. So I've seen quite a lot of running samples. So I think you're right. I think that will be the resurgence of adventure gaming, will be skills for Alexa and the equivalent Siri on the Apple. I'm certain of it, that people will be able to play at that level.
Yeah, and as a side effect, that could open up the games to the visually impaired as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There is actually there are some reader things that have been done for visually impaired users of adventure games. So it's already available out. Readers that allow them to read out. So it's a known issue that, and people enjoy that sort of environment. So that's already been done. And like you say, it will make it much more widely available though. And as my eyes get older, I think I could start enjoying text adventure games from my armchair again.
Well, on that thought, Tim, can you introduce us to your next track, please?
I can. We're sort of moving into the end of the 90s now, so games are getting really quite advanced, and my kids are a bit older, and we've got a network of LAN in the house. So they're sat in their rooms with TeamSpeak, and I'm sat in my room with TeamSpeak, and we're playing Unreal Tournament. And that tune, I'm always sat at the tune, because I'm about to spawn back into it. It's a brilliant piece of atmospheric music, and the game itself is just wonderful. You can't, it's you see yourselves in the game, and that you play online with friends. It's the real first online Avatar type game I was playing a lot of, and I spent most of my time like Tigger, bouncing around, and everyone say stand still so I can shoot you, but I did my best.
Stop camping.
Let's move forward a few years then, and I understand by now you've embraced online murder with Unreal Tournament. For you, were those 8-bit days long forgotten, or was the ZX Spectrum nearby and on standby ready to go?
No, I'm embarrassed to say they were all at the attic to make room for family in the house. The PCs that we had by then, I think ZX81 emulator. I had an 81 emulator, so I played a little bit with emulation. But I was pretty busy in my day job, which was IT work. So I think we sort of haven't touched on that. By now, I'd taken a full to come back from Spain, needed a job fairly quickly. So I'd seen an advert for a CAD operator for the fire service. So I thought, well, that'll do for the moment. I was still working remotely by modem to Spain at the time, fixing bugs and sorting things out for Aventuras AD. But obviously, I needed a fairly regular income as well. So I thought, well, if I get a local job, it'll be great. And the Illustrator came in really handy, because they said, have you ever used any computer-aided design packages? I said, no, but I've written a vector graphics package for a computer. So, great. So I landed the job, and that was quite pleasant. Of course, one of my A-levels was engineering drawing, so I had a background for doing the sort of computer design work, so drawing plans of buildings for their fire safety, security and that, so it's quite pleasant. Funny enough, though, it was the first day I turned up, the guy who'd interviewed me wasn't there. And there was this sort of sheet of paper on it with a list of problems. We can't get it to open, the hard drive's reporting this error. That doesn't look very good, does it? So I didn't know what else to do. So I just went through the list and fixed it all and drew a sample diagram and printed it out on a big giant plotter they had, which is great, watching a pen plotter go. I loved them. It picked up the pen and, they were beautiful. You just draw a picture just to have it, to watch the pen draw, It's brilliant. And it go and change the colour and have the red and the green. And playing with, it was brilliant fun. It was great first day in a real job. I never had a real job before. So I went home thoroughly happy with this folded bit of paper. I had a bit of a hobby of origami as well. So I worked out how to fold the paper so that the big A0 sheets had fit, collapsed in, concertinaed into the certificate. He came in the next day, so I'm so sorry I wasn't here. I realised you wouldn't be able to do anything. I left a sheet for IT to come over and fix everything. And so I did all them. So it's now working, and I fixed the Lisp error as well that was in the code. So
fantastic.
Yeah. So and they found out I was actually a real IT person then. So I don't think I did the CAD job for that long, about 3 months, and then suddenly it became an IT job.
So when you finished your day of IT, you'd go home. And if I recall, you were starting to get into online gaming at that point.
Yeah.
To the point where tactical and training nights took place. So was this with a plan?
Now, this is... Mandra and I had split up by this time. So I was having Dominic was quite young, probably 4 or 5. So I'd have him overnight and I wouldn't be able to go out with my mates and having a drink and things like that. So it wasn't so much the online gaming, it was the using TeamSpeak. It was an online pub. So my cousin was a member of a clan of older gamers who really were having a chat, and the game was the sort of the process we went through to have a couple of hours chatting in the evening, and people go and crack another can and have a chat and just enjoy things on it's a good way to spend a Friday evening. And part of the game I did enjoy playing it, and we will come on to I think my next selection in a minute, which is the game we were playing, which is Call of Duty. I'd really got into that as a multiplayer game, and he was in a clan called 5th Infantry Division, I think. There were few arguments amongst it, as you get in any group of 14 or 15 people, about people not turning up at training night. So Pilot's Jack Drin set her own clan up called the Social Club, which reflected more about what it was about. It was mostly sort of 30 and 40 somethings all enjoying chatting to each other and playing. But because of that, we actually had a bit of tactical thinking as well. So when we got new recruits, we'd run a proper training course from about how to camp, how to not run forward gung ho, how to stay at your post rather than leaving the doorway undefended, the sort of stuff that other teams really weren't doing. So actually, we didn't do too badly as a group of people. We weren't bad, and we actually taught each, to practice running down, throwing a grenade over a Carantan wall to make sure you hit the group that were always standing there the other side. So tactical plans. I mean, obviously with my CAD background, I used to mail out a CAD tactical plan for that night's battle with the arrows showing directions and who was to. So, like anything, I got more involved in managing the server and doing things than actually playing the game. I think that became a bit of a theme tune through my life. I always get more involved in the technology, really. But that we come back to why I picked the 2003 PC Call of Duty. I think it was it was a next step up in that 3D gaming, and I remember playing the single player campaign, and I got as far as Stalingrad. If you've played that bit of it, you come off a boat, you're in a shuffled line, you get either given a gun or some bullets, you follow behind, a guy gets shot, and you pick up a gun, and you're trying to get up the hill, and if you go backwards, the commissar shoots you. And I had it on my big surround sound, big screen on a computer, and I just felt so futile, and the bullets are raining down, and the sound effects are, and I'm thinking, crumbs, this is really terrifying. I would hate to experience this in life. I really would. And I think it's the first game that really gave me that thing that we're getting very close now to experiencing life in these sort of interactive environments. And of course, when you added that online team plan type idea, and you're up against another group of 6 humans, and then you won. That was brilliant. It's that playing with other people. It's just an experience, and unless someone's had a go at it, you're really going to struggle to understand it, because you're pitted against other humans. It's not just some AI. It's a really good game.
So after putting the online world to rights, the call of those 8 bits returned, as it did for many of us, and you found yourself drawn to retro computing again.
Good.
So how did that happen?
Well, I can't exactly remember whether the Next drew me in or I was already involved. I think I'd already started, I think it came through a couple of interviews that I was asked to do. This sort of what Phil describes as the wave of nostalgia. And a few people had approached me for some interviews, mainly the Spanish ones initially. I'd been sent, one of the guys we used to work with in Spain is writing a book about the history of Aventuras AD, the company I work with in Spain, in Valencia. And he wanted to get some memoirs and perceptions from my side of it, and sent me a big selection of questions. And so, of course, I dug some of the paperwork out from the attic and bits and pieces. And I think it was those sort of initial, I couldn't remember, to be honest. I couldn't remember the 80s. So it was all a bit of a blur, really. And I started piecing together from all the different questions I had. So I had some from, we did an article for Retro Gamer. Stefan did one for me, So there was a lot of people asking for information and interviews, and that got me back into thinking about it. I got the stuff out, and I found that my Spectrum didn't work, so I got my oscilloscope out, and then, just suddenly the desk started growing, and then I remembered, I got a stock of parts somewhere. There's some ULAs, there's a TR5, I can fix this Spectrum. So I got my Spectrum working again, and it just sort of grew from there, really. And then, where's my Commodore 64 gone? I'd like to hear some SID tunes again, and I haven't got a CA64 anymore. I wonder what happened to that. Well, I'll buy one on eBay. It can't be that bad. Well, 3 completely broken 1540 ones that are used as door stops at the moment, 2 completely dead C64s. They're both working again now, fully recapped. I've got 1 dead channel on one of the SIDs, but I've now got a collection of 64s sat in a box that I've repaired. I had great fun repairing all the kit, I think, was where I started. And then I picked up on the next project through Enrique and the guys, and I thought, wow, that looks ideal, because I realised how fragile some of these older kit was. So I have a modern Spectrum, like using my big screen TV, and things, that would be great, and it's got a Raspberry Pi in it, which I was sort of into the electronics bit with the Pi and the Arduino stuff. I've been playing with that, and I thought, that's an ideal little case to have a Pi in and play with both. So that'd be great. I'll back that. So I stuck that Kickstarter in, and sort of got drawn into the next world, shall we say. So, especially when the board arrived. But by then I'd started pulling everything out of the attic. I'm actually very carefully pointing this video camera at the one clear bit of wall, because the rest of the study is the contents of 3 attics, full of machines like Amigas and Spanish machines and joysticks and piles of software and discs. I mean, the thousands of discs I've had to go through to get some of the stuff back. and the miracles of working. I've got an old PC that I've jacked up to be able to read old discs, and it's been great fun learning. It's all the amazing software people have done over the years to recover old discs. It's been a real journey and been a really interesting sort of thing to do as a hobby in the evenings, because obviously it's that age we get to. You can't spend all your life in the pub drinking beer.
Well, you've touched on the ZX Spectrum there. So for those of us who don't know, can you just explain to us in a nutshell what the ZX Spectrum Next is?
I can. It's a project that was put together by a couple of guys, Fabio Benaventuro, and the sort of based on this Brazilian engineer who's done a lot of, if you come across the term, FPGA work. So it's a field programmable gate array. It's basically, the Spectrum had a ULA in it, which is an uncommitted logic array, and Sinclair had to spend tens of thousands getting masks and printing the chips. The FPGA is the modern equivalent. You just basically give it a set of a byte stream, as it's called, and it configures itself as any electronics you want. And they've basically recreated all sorts of cores for MSXs, and they had the Spectrum core. There's a lot of open source work done in this area for Z80 chip. It is really the hardware. People call it emulation, but it's not. It really does run a version of the hardware programmed on at the time of power on. So it's a year late now, but it is, I think, a worthy final Spectrum. It is completely compatible with all the ZX range, so 48, 1 to 8, plus 3. You can run anything on it pretty much from the entire range of Spectrums. Loads of extra memory, and some really good developers have come back to the fold to write it. And I got involved in writing for it because I was chatting to... what was I chatting to? Can't remember. But they were mentioning about, obviously development. I had the board come through because they shipped some bare boards over 14 months ago. I got it in a Spectrum case, and it's been just like programming the old days, And Gary Lancaster, I think it was, mentioned that he wanted the real-time clock routine to timestamp the files, and the original code that was done by Victor Trucco only put the date on, not the time. And there was only 256 bytes to read the real-time clock in. And I said, I can have a crack at that. I'll probably get it to be able to read time and minutes and whatever. So I spent about a week getting it down to 256 bytes so it could read the full real-time clock, and integrated it to the operating system. And then Gary said, it'd be a good idea to double it up to 512 bytes, wouldn't it? I thought, well, not really, no. But I was hooked. Back to, it was just like the 80s again, creating something in a very limited environment that you can actually achieve something within a few days without learning hideously complex. And it's just been great fun. So I've ended up writing network drivers and all sorts for it because, it's going to connect to the internet. And Robin's done an amazing recreation of Prestel type CFAX environment for it. So you can get online with it, read the pages on Nextel over the internet. It's basically got everything you want in a modern machine.
So are you finding the development, are they quite disciplined? Because there's always going to be that temptation when you're using FPGAs that if there's something you don't like about the underlying hardware architecture, you can change that. And then that's eventually you're going to get a lot of annoyed programmers.
Yeah, and I think there has been since the boards came out, and there were a few games, Software Amusements have launched a couple of games already for it and sold them. There's been a massive effort to make sure that they always run on any new release of the core, because there are games out there already, and we don't know what games are already in development. Then people suddenly come out of the woodwork with new games. So very much the core has been about stability. There's lots of extra new things coming in, which might have been easier to use that new technology. Like recently, they've managed to cram in a tile mode, which will allow some really clever games to be done, I think. But it's still, I think, got the ethos of the this is no more than an 8-bit ever could have been. If you could have developed a chip that the 8-bit level. So, and there's a limit as well. The FPGA has a limit. I mean, it's at that limit. Victor sort of teased the world with a SID chip implementation in it, but it took up half of the FPGA. So it is not. Luckily, it's not in, because that would have been a terrible hybrid, I think. But that's not to say there won't be another core you can load on it, because of course you can have 30 or 40 slots on it and make it into a BBC or a Commodore if you want. But I think it's fairly true to the Spectrum heritage and what could have been achieved if Sinclair had added some specialist graphics chips to it, which he never did, of course, because they would have added cost.
Yeah.
So if he'd had the sort of gumption of doing what the Amiga team did and developed something special in the way of a graphics chip, then yeah, I think it still feels Z80. You have to be a Z80 programmer. It's got a copper like the Amiga had, but it's very much more Spectrum-like, because it's quite simplistic in what it can do. So it still feels easy to get into. It's certainly a Spectrum heritage. No one's added like 3D vector floating point to it on anything silly. So I think we've still got an 8-bit computer, which is great. And it, like I say, it's going to feel like a nice little console, because in the end, it's just going to sit in a cupboard if you can't play some nice games as well, isn't it?
Yeah. I was reading an article recently about hauntology, which is nostalgia for futures lost. So futures that you were promised on things like Tomorrow's World that never actually happened. And the ZX Spectrum is almost the realization of that, isn't it? It was the kind of future that we perhaps yearned for, the next ZX Spectrum, what it could have become, but never actually happened. But now it's finally happening.
And I think we talked about it before, how the Spectrum in Russia, how it sort of evolved and continued.
It did. And they did some really clever stuff with it, taking the beta disk environment and adding extra memory. But it was still a Spectrum, and it still had a lot of its Spectrum. TR-DOS was around on the beta disk as an interface. We had one in Gilsoft. We never actually did do a disk version for the beta disk, because it's almost impossible to get any documentation on it. But, the NEX can do a lot of what happened in the Russian environment as well.
They'll be insisting the NEX is compatible with their software.
Yeah. And in fact, some of the Russian teams have produced some really great games for it. So, it's there's some really good-looking stuff coming out of the Russian teams on the NEX. So I think we'll hopefully it's a way to get into the Spectrum world without having that. I missed 20 years of Spectrum development, and I come back to it. The NEX has got all those little bits already developed. The hard work was done by, with the SX-DOS and the div MMC and all that sort of things. It'll run ESX-DOS if you want to see what the Spectrum's been working on with SD cards over the years. So it can do pretty much everything that's happened to the Spectrum. And that's it. It's all one nice little package. So hopefully it'll actually get used rather than just sitting in its beautiful box.
Well, Tim, would you like to introduce us to your next tune?
Right. Okay. Clever. Well, this is one. It's actually a bit of a cheat, because it's not off of a game. For those who don't know, Gari Biasillo is a fairly well-known game chiptune author from back in the day, and he has produced an absolutely amazing package that really is the Quill, I think, of music. That's the best way I can describe it. It basically lets you take, because of course the NEX can't just have the dual AYs that were added in the Russian scene. It has to go one better. So it's got 3 AY chips. We've got 9 channels of music. And NextDAW, it really does make it easy to compose tunes on the NEX. Patches, editing, piano roll. It's as good as you'd see on any of the 16 or modern machines, I think. And it makes the Spectrum sing and dance. And to demonstrate how good it is, he's arranged. Well, I have to be honest. Only You just feels 80s today on the Next. And if you listen to it, you're just taken back to that time, but with a really modern spin on it. It just shows what the next audio capability, what the Spectrum could have been then.
Tim, you now have 2 important decisions to make before we leave you on Retro Island. You can pick only one of the 8 tracks you've shared with us today to keep you company. Which will it be?
Ooh. That's actually a really hard question, and one I should have thought of in advance, shouldn't I? I'd say if I was going to go for anything, it would probably be the Tomb Raider music. It's just because you can sit there and take yourself to a different world, which you'll probably need occasionally when sat on an island with just the sound of the sea bashing against the wall, which I hear a lot anyway, living in a seaside town. So it's just not very sunny, and there's no palm trees.
And you can take with you, Tim, one game or application to enjoy on Retro Island, the only condition being that it has no internet connectivity. What will you take with you?
Well, I'm going to take Professional Adventure Writer with me because I'm going to write the games I never bothered writing with my own tool and always thought about doing.
You've made your choices, Tim, and we hope they serve you well in your survival on Retro Island. Thank you so much for sharing your fascinating history with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure, guys.
Thank you, Tim. And if you enjoyed the show today, why not take a moment to check out the other podcast episodes, or you can find more retro goodness on my YouTube channel, RetroManCave.
And you can find me on the YouTube channel BackOfficeShow, to which you'll find links in the show notes as well as Tim's choices. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.